There was not one single word in the Prime Minister's statement of condemnation of the Israeli destruction of the Iranian consulate in Damascus.
Well, we've called for restraint before. We called for restraint with regard to the attack on Gaza, yet the indiscriminate bombing took place. We called for restraint on the settlements in the West Bank, and yet the settlements have expanded. We called for restraint so that food could be got to the children of Gaza, and yet malnutrition is killing some of them. So what action will the government take if Israel does not show restraint?
Suella Bratham.
Mr. Speaker, and please accept my condolences on the loss of your father.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, I was in Israel at the northern border with Lebanon. And of course, we've all seen what happened this weekend. But since October the 7th, Iran-backed Hezbollah has fired over 4,000 rockets into northern Israel, displacing over 150,000 Israeli civilians. I met some of those families. They're under siege, they've been uprooted, but they are brave and defiant in the face of terrorism and anti-Semitism. Mr. Speaker, we have known for years that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is the world's chief sponsor of terrorism, funding and promoting terrorist plots, radicalisation and hostage-taking, both in the Middle East and at home. Mr. Speaker, we have proscribed Hamas. We have proscribed Hezbollah. Prime Minister, why don't we put the UK's... Prime Minister, why don't we put the UK's national security first by now prescribing the IRGC?
Mr. Speaker, as the Right Honourable Lady knows, that we don't comment on any potential prescription decisions, but of course we recognise the threat from Iran and have taken measures to counter it at home and around the world. I obviously refer her to my previous answer, but I'm confident the police, security services and courts all have the tools that they need to sanction, prosecute and mitigate the threats from Iran. We've strengthened our sanctions regime recently, and including sanctioning the IRGC in its entirety.
Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the calls for a ceasefire here in our Parliament and across the international community, the war in Gaza has raged, costing 33,000 lives, as well as the 1,200 killed by Hamas attacks, and a humanitarian catastrophe that is now turning to a famine. For months, many have raised the spectre of the concern around regional escalation. Can the Prime Minister say more about precisely what conversations he's having with the leading figures in the Israeli government, as well as through various parties, to influence the Iranian regime to de-escalate as quickly as possible, given the seriousness of the crisis?
Well, both the Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary have spoken to their counterparts over the weekend, including the Foreign Secretary has spoken to the Iranian Foreign Minister specifically to urge de-escalation and condemn what happened over the weekend. I'm speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu shortly, and I can reassure her and all members of the House that we will continue, together with our allies, to urge calm heads to prevail and de-escalation. And we think that's the right course forward. And as said, across all levels of government, that's the message that we will taking to everyone.
Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is another country that is under almost constant daily bombardment by Iranian-made drones. That country is Ukraine. Some 3 years ago, I pleaded with the Israelis to help Ukraine against Russia, and they refused, even though Russia was spending $500 million in the Iranian drone program. I know the Prime Minister is speaking to the Prime Minister of Israel later today. Now that RAF pilots have quite rightly gone to the defence of Israel, could he perhaps ask that Israel now decides that it is time to help Ukraine in their hour of need, and we can see off both Russia and Iranian aggression?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for the role he's played in ensuring UK security and that of our allies over previous years. He's right, as my statement alluded to as well. The Ukrainians are suffering from Iranian drones over the same weekend that this happened. And I'm also pleased, not only will I take up his points of always with all our allies, urging them to do more to support Ukraine. I know he will have welcomed the recent announcement a few weeks ago of more support from the UK to Ukraine, specifically in the areas of uncrewed platforms on autonomous warfare, to make sure that the Ukrainians both have the ability they need to protect themselves and conduct their operations. And the majority of the 10,000 new platforms that we are delivering to the Ukrainians will have been developed in the UK, which I know is something that he was keen to ensure that we saw the benefits of here at home. I'm glad that has been realised, supporting Ukraine and their security and bolstering the British defence industry here at home.
John MacDonald.
There's consensus across the House, rightfully so, to call for restraint on the Israeli government. But we've called for restraint before. We called for restraint with regard to the attack on Gaza, yet the indiscriminate bombing took place. We called for restraint on the settlements in the West Bank, and yet the settlements have expanded. We called for a restraint so that food could be got to the children of Gaza, and yet malnutrition is killing some of them. So what action will the government take if Israel does not show restraint? Because we're in danger of the Middle East being set alight by the decisions taken by the right-wing factions within the Netanyahu cabinet.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I missed the part of the honourable gentleman's question where he condemned Iran and Hamas for what they've done. But we will always encourage de-escalation in the region, and I'm proud of the role the UK is playing to bring that about.
Kit Walters.
Speaker, the Prime Minister was quite right to authorise the defence of Israel and the avoidance of violence and death. But violence has also erupted in the West Bank, as he will know over the last few days. What concrete steps can we take to protect those civilians too?
Mr. Speaker, the issue of settler violence in the West Bank is something that I have personally repeatedly raised with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as indeed have my colleagues, including the Deputy Foreign Minister, and we have joined with allies in sanctioning activity of particular individuals where it has been brought to our attention, and we will continue to ensure that the Israeli government does everything it can to reduce tensions in the West Bank. We don't think it's conducive to long-term peace in the region, and that's why I said we've taken action where we can, as well as being very explicit about our concerns with the Israeli government.
George Galloway.
Mr. Speaker, I knew your father well for a very long time. He was a fine man, and I am sincerely sorry for your loss. There was not one single word in the Prime Minister's statement of condemnation of the Israeli destruction of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which is the proximate reason for the event everyone is here in concert condemning. He was not even asked to do so by the front bench opposite. Kay Burley is the only person so far to demand that of a government minister. We have no treaty with Israel, at least not one that Parliament has been shown. And the Iranians are not likely to listen to him. When Britain occupied Iran, looted its wealth, and overthrew its one democratic socialist government in my own lifetime.
Well, Mr. Speaker, whatever may have happened a few weeks ago, it is absolutely no justification for launching more than 300 drones and missiles from one sovereign state towards Israel. It's as simple as that. And in the honourable gentleman's question, not once did he condemn that action, or indeed the actions of Hamas in the region. There is no equivalence between these things whatsoever, and to suggest otherwise is simply wrong.
Robert Holford.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his strong support for the State of Israel. Last year, as Israel and Saudi Arabia were about to strike a transformational agreement, Iran-backed Hamas carried out its massacre on October the 7th with the aim of torpedoing the chance of peace between Israel and the Arab nations. And last Saturday's drone attack by Iran, being thwarted by Israel and her allies, including Jordan, demonstrated that Arab countries can work alongside Israel after this new period of contention. So does my right honourable friend agree that this represents a new opportunity for Israel and the Arab nations to rebuild relations in the aftermath of October 7th and bring the hostages home?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. It is significant that other regional partners actually helped to prevent a much worse attack over the weekend, and it reminds us how important attempts are to normalise relations between Israel and its neighbours. It holds out precious hope for the region. It's exactly that hope that Iran and its proxies are trying to snuff out, and we should work very hard to combat that.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to you and your family, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I condemn Iran and Hamas, let me start there, but we must not lose focus on the situation in Gaza, where there is a humanitarian crisis, famine, and it's just destruction that people are seeing in front of their eyes. But if we want to ensure that the hostages come home, like the hostage that's been adopted in Brent, Noah Argamani, we must argue for a ceasefire and not a pause. Will the Prime Minister clearly state that we should be calling for an immediate ceasefire on all sides?
Mr. Speaker, it's wrong to suggest in any way that we have lost sight of what is happening in Gaza, and indeed the G7 statement yesterday referenced specifically our desire to cooperate to end the crisis in Gaza, working towards an immediate humanitarian pause where hostages can be released, aid can go in and build the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire, and crucially deliver more humanitarian assistance into the region. It's welcome that we have seen an increase in that flow over the past few days and weeks, but far more aid has to get in, and that's the pressure that we will continue to put on all partners concerned.